18. We're going to hang out there pretty much the whole lesson today. Again, without a screen means we have no projector, which means I'm doing more textual studies for a little while. But very distinct possibility we could order the screen this week, and it could possibly be in next Sunday. No promises, but we're getting very close. Thank you for all the feedback you've given us on the room and direction and aisles and how seating works best. It's been very helpful. Really appreciate it. All right. So we're going to start reading in John chapter 18 here. It says, "When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen, went out and asked them, 'Who is it that you want?' 'Jesus of Nazareth,' they replied. 'I am he,' Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, 'I am he,' they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, 'Who is it you want?' 'Jesus of Nazareth,' they said. Jesus answered, 'I told you that I am he. If you're looking for me, then let these men go.' This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. 'I have not lost one of those you gave me.'" Now let's stop and think about what's going on right here. This is the night before Jesus is going to be crucified. He will be up all night this night. Between his arrest, his mockery of a trial, his flogging and scourging, his being led down the Via Dolorosa to the place of suffering, he's going to get zero sleep. He knew he had to be praying to get this strength together for this unbearable day. And he knew what was going to happen before it happened, the Bible said. He knew Judas was going to betray him. They had already had the Last Supper, right? And he even told Judas, he told all the disciples, "One of you is going to betray me." And when everybody kind of went around the table except Judas and said, is it me, is it me? Jesus just looked at Judas and said, "What you've got to do, go do quickly." And so all of this is culminating right now. Jesus' betrayal, his trial, his crucifixion, it's all coming into play right now. And it's hard for us to imagine someone who walked 3 years with Jesus, who saw the love that he had, who saw the compassion that he had, who saw the miracles that he did, who had no doubt in their mind that Jesus was the Messiah. He was the promised one. That person could betray him. That someone who walked with him that closely could let their heart get away from him to the point that they became selfish and greedy and just wanted to see what they could get out of it and leave Jesus in the worst possible situation. We call that betrayal, right? We call Judas the traitor for that reason. Now pick up with me in verse 12. "Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one man died for the people. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard, but Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. 'You aren't one of this man's disciples, too, are you?' she asked Peter. He replied, 'I am not.' It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching." Now hold that thought just for a second. Also, around the same time this thing happened with Judas, Peter comes so confidently to Jesus and says, "Lord, I will never betray you. I would die before I would let anything like that happen. I will stand up for you no matter what." And Jesus gave him a personal prophecy. And he said, "Peter, before the rooster crows tomorrow morning, you will have denied me 3 times. And he's like, "Never. It won't happen. You've got the wrong guy." But things changed so quickly between the time he said those words and the time they went to the garden, and the time the soldiers came. And the prophecy from the Old Testament said the shepherd is struck and the sheep scatter. And that's exactly what happened. And Peter, who thought, there's no way I can ever see myself denying Jesus or betraying Jesus or embarrassing him or bringing any shame to his name, within just a few hours, things had changed so much that Jesus' personal prophecy, of course, came true. Now pick up with me in verse 25. Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there warming himself. So they asked him, "You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" He denied it, saying, "I am not." One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off earlier in the evening, challenged him. "Did I see you with them in the garden?" Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment, a rooster began to crow. One of the other gospel accounts says he began calling curses down on himself, as if to say, if I know that man, if I have anything to do with that Jesus, I'd just bring curses on myself. I mean, who does that? Who says, may I just be cursed if I'm lying, when they know they're lying? Huh? Actually, yeah, I watch some of these, police shows sometimes, where they arrest people. And one of the first things that comes out of a guilty person's mouth is, I swear to God, it wasn't me. And I'm like, don't swear to God that it wasn't you when it was. You're swearing to God that it wasn't you and it was. And you're about to be caught. But I hear that phrase so much. Now, in a vacuum, we would think that would be hard to do, right? But Todd's right. It happens all the time. And I want to talk about how do you recover from a fall today? Because every one of us have, at some point in our life, just embarrassed ourselves with our Christianity, or lack thereof, right? We have worn the name of Christ, and we have done something that is very un-Christ-like, and we have fallen. Now, I want to do some comparison and some contrasting between Judas and Peter here, okay? There are some things that were the same. We give Judas the bad rap, but what Peter did, really, was it that much worse than what Judas did? I mean, it had the same net effect. He abandoned Jesus in his time of need. He got on the other side of wherever Jesus was. Now, one may have been a betrayal with a kiss, which seems terrible, but the other one is 3 denials back to back after a promise, I will never do that. They both left Jesus without a friend. They both left him at the worst possible time to leave him and said, well, let the chips fall where they may. Right? Now, Judas got 30 pieces of silver out of it. Peter just felt like I escaped some persecution because of it. But the net effect was not really that different. Well, what's the contrast? What's the difference between what Judas did and what Peter did? Judas had been letting his heart go for a long time. Even before this night, Judas was the money keeper for the 12. He was the money keeper for the apostles. And sometimes he would take money that was given for the poor and he would use it for selfish purposes. Wow. And we thought financial scandals in the church were new things, right? No, they've been going on for at least 2,000 years, right? At least 2,000 years. What Peter did was he was overconfident in where he thought he was in his discipleship. That was his downfall. He thought of himself more highly than he really was. And sometimes we tend to go off thinking, well, you know what? I'm a pretty good Christian. I'm a pretty good Christian. I wouldn't be like those other people out there that do these things. And the Bible says, watch your pride, lest you fall. Watch out, lest you think you're better than you are. When I was very first in ministry, one of my very first kind of leaders meetings, I don't mean in the church, I mean like leaders from a bunch of different churches that meet up once a month, preachers or pastors or whatever, all this kind of stuff. I got some really good advice. And this was it. Just because you've got a great moral track record and you see one of these other leaders fall, don't ever get yourself in the position to say, that would never be me. Because the minute you think that could be you is the minute you've made yourself vulnerable to Satan's attack. Instead, say, there with the grace of God go I, and I realize I am vulnerable, and I will take whatever precautions and set whatever boundaries I need to minimize the chances of that happening. And then this is old, really even older brother. He's one of these African American brothers who just had that kind of African American gospel style speaking, you know, that kind of thing. He said, let me tell you young brothers some advice. He said, stay away from the honey and the money. I was like, that kind of stuck with me, you know? That kind of stuck with me. So we always try to, you know, have good financial just boundaries in place for our church and our offering and counting and depositing and that kind of thing. And I try to be really, really careful about where I go and what I'm doing and who I'm with and alone too long and who I won't meet in private or will in public and that kind of thing. So it's good to try to prevent ourselves from falling. It is. It really is. But there are times every one of us have done something that has embarrassed God, right? It's like, oh, I committed to repent of that sin, and now here I am in that sin. All right? So what do we do after we fall? What do we do? The comparison is both people let Jesus down. Judas and Peter both did. The contrast is that Judas already had a bad heart, and he intended to do it. It was a premeditated crime, right? Where Peter really thought he was better than he was, and he thought, it doesn't matter how bad things get, I will never deny you, Jesus. And he was too confident for where he really was. Now, I'm not saying Jesus set him up for a fall. I don't think Jesus does that. But I think God does allow us, just by the natural way he set things up and natural consequences, that when we overestimate where we are spiritually, it will be tested. There will come a time where we will be tested on where we think we are, and we may find out in that moment we're not where we thought we were. That should be a learning experience. That should be a growth experience right there. Okay? So let's think about physical falls for just a moment. Now, my wife is a social worker, and one of her part-time jobs is she works in the trauma department at a local hospital. So she sees fall victims all the time. They may have fallen off a motorcycle that was going 50 miles an hour. They may have fallen off a ladder. They may have fallen off a roof. They may have just tripped and fallen because they're old and they lost their balance, or they're having some kind of vertigo problem or something like that. But she treats all kinds of people who have fallen in all kinds of different ways. And I got to thinking, wow, you know, there's probably a plan that they have in the hospital for this. There's probably a way that they treat people when they come in and this kind of thing. And I was kind of just curious about that. You know, what do you do? So I've heard these stories from her over and over and over again about, she comes up, the first few weeks she worked at the hospital in the trauma unit,